I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here. Glad to have you along. Friday, normally we do the Healing Circle, but we will continue with the Healing Circle next week for the next season of it. In the meantime, we're reaching out to our connections and friends and with the intent of bringing what we think is valuable content, good information, things you need to know. And we're particularly pleased to connect with our friends over at the Minnesota Latino Leadership Alliance. It's called MIA, which is conducting a 2024 public policy agenda meeting at the Capitol on Monday. We're going to be streaming a recording of that, so stay tuned for that. It's an important discussion. Here with me now is Luis Argueta, and he's the communications officer at the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. Joining me also is my colleague and editor of our Afrodescendientes section of Inside News. He's joining us from Bahia in Brazil, Yoji Senna. Luis, Yoji, good afternoon, guys. How are you both?
Doing fantastic. Thank you, Al.
Oh, okay, and Yoji, you're muted, but that's okay. How are you doing?
Thank you.
Before we get done, I want to spend some time talking to you about Carnival. It started yesterday in Brazil. That's a big deal. And hopefully within the half an hour or so, we'll be joined by our other writer-editor from Caracas, Venezuela, Brother Jesus Chucho Garcia. So it should be a good program. To those who are listening on any of our social media platforms, let people know that we're here. Send a note, send a post, make a call, a tweet, and say that we're doing the Conversation with Al McFarlane, and it's a good program. We want you to be a part of it. Luis, let me first thank you for being here. I got your press release a couple of days ago about the event coming up Monday, and I thought it'd be a great conversation. So I'm so glad you were amenable and available. Let's jump right in. Let me ask you to invite people or tell people what's going to be happening Monday at the state capitol from 9:30 to 10 a.m.
Yeah, so we've actually got two kind of events happening right early in the morning. So Monday, we figured this made the most sense. Monday just happens to be the start of Minnesota's legislative session. And so early in the morning, 8:30, right in front of the Capitol steps, there's going to be a rally. I know Representative Maria Isa, Representative Perez Vega is moving and kind of leading the charge on this. The rally is in support of Minnesota's first Latino museum. So that is a bonding project that is being led forth by the representative. And I believe that the senator, that the author might be Sandy Pappas. And so there's going to be, a crowd swell, hopefully, Monday morning. If you can show up, if by some chance you happen to have Monday, February 12th, 8:30 a.m. available, right? Come on down to the Capitol steps, support. Let's let it be known. I think that's a really great project. It's one of the many areas that the alliance itself is focused on. And so at 9:30 in the morning, down in the Capitol press room, we're going to be speaking as the alliance as a whole. That's 11 Latino-led organizations that are coming together to talk and discuss their talking points, who they are as an organization, what they're doing for the community. And they're also going to be looking at, what are they kind of pushing forward in terms of public policy. It's fantastic that these organizations have been coming together, having discussions, and so that way they can kind of support one another.
The organization is MILA, Minnesota Latino Leadership Alliance. Who are the members? You mentioned the 11 members. Can you recall which organizations? So a lot of them are storied legacy organizations that people do know, but give them some credit. And if you want to share what the forte might be for one or two, that'd be great.
So, and if I can clarify too, I just want to make sure that MIA is an alliance,
Mhm.
right? So there isn't any kind of like leader or it's not a actual established organization. So it's a banner where Latino led organizations can kind of come together.
Got it.
But it kind of came forth last year with last year's. And I think a lot of us know last year saw a lot of wins, legislative wins, and MIA was able to come together. These organizations had a unified public policy agenda. So as you can see just on the screen right now, right, organizations include Latino Lead, ACER, Opal, Minnesota Immigration Movement, Common Cause Minnesota, New Moralismos, Esperanza United, Latino Economic Development Center, Latino Chamber of Commerce of Minnesota, and ACLA, which is the Alliance of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Latin Americans. That one is actually really, really cool. I think one of the goals from Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs, outside of the alliance, is that we have more engagement, not just in the urban Twin Cities, but also greater Minnesota. So to have an alliance from Rochester, kind of be representative and to have a voice in this unified public policy agenda, I think that's fantastic.
Take a minute, and if you would, go back and talk about the critical role that the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs plays. Give us Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs 101 background. What's the
background? Yes. So the Council on Latino Affairs, it's gone through a couple name changes, but essentially it's been we're a state agency. We work directly with the state of Minnesota. We're advising the governor on legislation and policy. The organization has now hit 46 years. There was a big celebration last year with hitting 45. Mm-hmm. So I think it's fantastic that we were able to come together. Back in 2015, there was some change in statute that kind of identified some ethnic councils. So we're one of 3 ethnic councils here in the state of Minnesota. So there's a Latino Affairs, there's African Heritage Council, and there's also the Asian Pacific Council as well. So what we do is we make sure that we're leading, supporting, and monitoring legislation that can help and be of help to the Latino community. And what we do just even off session is we're listening to the community, we're engaging. In the past year, even if you look on our website, we have some resources where we've actually put together reports on surveys and a lot of community engagement. And it's based off of those reports and what we hear back from the community. That's how we then prioritize what we're looking at in terms of policy and legislation.
Talk about the Latino community in Minnesota. What's been the growth of it? It's been significant in Minnesota and throughout the country. Give us a description of who
Huge.
We are. Talk about that.
That's actually, it's pretty great that you touch on that because, I feel like there's kind of 2 stories happening here. One, Minnesota Latinos have been in Minnesota for generations, right? Mm-hmm. Not just in the Twin Cities, but also in other parts of Minnesota. As I've had more conversations with stakeholders across the state, especially Latino stakeholders, right? There's families that are already in their 3rd, 4th, 5th generations. These are families that have already, lived in Worthington for years, that have lived in Long Prairie, that have lived in Longdale. So there's a lot of different communities, Latino communities that have sprouted all over the state. So that's fantastic. Looking at 2020 census data, there are 346,000 Latinos in the state of Minnesota. And I don't think I need to remind you, right? I think we know that it's difficult to also get certain members of our Latino community to trust just putting down any kind of information or writing. So, I mean, I would say at a minimum, right, at least 346,000 Latinos in the state of Minnesota. So it's a huge growth.
And where does that come from? I'm trying to think of what it was, might have been 20 years ago or 40 years ago. Do you have an idea of what the rate of growth has been? And what is that growth attributed to?
Not off the top, but I'll say that it was a significant growth. I will refer you back to that. It's called MCLA's Portrait of a Latinx Community on our website, mn.gov/MCLA. And in that report, it does actually show the year by year or like the decades, kind of looking at previous census data, but it has grown significantly. I mean, to get to a point that it's, I think, just off the top of my head, ballpark, I mean, the growth went from the 200,000s into that 346,000 that was reported. And it's tapered off now. It looks like the Census Bureau kind of does an updated like American survey, something along those lines. And it looks like that number is kind of floating between 346 and 325,000, right? But again, reported Latinos in Minnesota.
And so what do you think, or what do you say is the impact of the Latino presence in Minnesota? Let me set the question up like this. My experience here is that my family came here from Kansas City, came to Worthington, one of the first Black families in Worthington, and we were in connection with the Latino families there as well, back in 1964, 65. But when I moved to Twin Cities and started working in journalism, the Black community had around 30,000, 40,000 people. I'm not sure what the size of the Latino community was at that time. I know that there were traditional Latino communities in St. Paul on the west side, for example, and in South Minneapolis and in North Minneapolis, some families that have been around for generations that are known, and some rivalries that were classic between families that are in the community culture lore. But here's this chart. And so the point I'm making is that early on,
It's pretty odd.
our numbers were so small that Minnesota generally felt like it could ignore the presence, and that the order of the day was that you all want to be like us. We are the standard, the norm for what it is to be a human being. And you are lucky to have a chance to be in our presence and do all you can to sound like us, act like us, and protect and vote and support our interests. That's regardless of what your interest may be, right? That's what I perceive to be the attitude of the majority in the 60s and before that, from what I've read. And so the numbers then have changed dramatically with Latino community, with the Afro community, with the Asian community. And it's a whole new day. It's a big deal. Things have changed, and the change shows up in our communities in people whose attitude is really reflective of their cultural identity and our own definition of who we are, irrespective of what the majority thinks about who they are or who we are. So we don't feel bound to demonstrate to them that we're just like them. I think what's new is that we as communities are saying we have answers. We have answers for humanity, and you have problems, and we're showing up as the solution to the problem. That's my take. Luis, what do you think?
I agree. I think when I think of the Latino community, when I think of even my parents, there's just this entrepreneurial spirit, right? And so oftentimes it's these Latinos that are coming into communities and they're bringing new business, they're bringing new ideas, they're bringing new culture into these communities, and that's where you see growth occur. So I mean, it's actually really great then when I look at the work that these organizations are doing that are in the alliance and the focus on economic development and the workforce. I think it's fantastic that not only do we look at how can the Latino community prosper, but also how can we make sure that they remain protected as well.
Yoji, any ideas, suggestions, thoughts? You lived here 32 years, I believe, right? And you've got a unique perspective as a first generation person here who's also gone back home to Bahia. And it's wonderful that we remain connected through our relationship with Afrodescendientes. But what are your thoughts, reflections on the change and the growth of communities of color in Minnesota, the African, Afro-Latino, the Asian populations and beyond? How has it looked to you?
Yeah. Well, since I arrived there in Minnesota in the 90s, in 92, I was a witness of this exponential growth on the minorities or the immigrant populations. For example, in the last few years, the staggering growth of the Ecuadorian immigrant population, it's remarkable, and also the West Africans that are concentrated in Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center.
Mm-hmm.
Myself now, I want to make a question to Mr. Luis, because I am in certainly this intersection, being Afro Latino American. Even though being Brazilian, we do not agree very much with the classification of being Latino Americanos or Hispanics, neither less. But I want to know, since you are also part of our organization that are representing the Latino population, I want to know what is being done in your organization internally and what kind of plan action you have about to decrease the invisibility that exists about the Afro-Latinos, and about also expression of open racism that is rampant on the Latino community, that many times it's shielded by the presumption that blacks don't speak Spanish. So I want to know if there is any concern about conscientization in the larger Latino community about that. Sometimes some of them are replicating those structural racism. They are doing personal events of offenses to other Latinos, but that have a darker tone of color.
I think that's
because
a great question.
many times we don't exist. There is like in the Latino establishment in Minneapolis is mainly Mexican, and kind of the other ones are in the periphery and not allowed into decision making in certain way. More though those Afro Latinos.
Yeah. So again, Yoji, great question. I think luckily with time, there's more awareness that has been happening and that is occurring. I think it's been fantastic. I've just recently joined the organization. I'm just hitting about 90 days, but we've hit the ground running and we've been kind of really working on some really cool projects. But one of the great things that I've noted right away working for the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs is the rhetoric, the tone. Everyone talks about inclusivity. We're talking about not just certain communities. Our executive director, Rosa Talk, she's very aware that, we're not just representing Mexican community or Guatemalan or any, we're looking at all. So when we're even looking at internal documents, we speak about, we're taking Caribbean, Afro-Latinos, even now, just as we were also just looking at just celebrating and just, again, recognizing that this month is Black History Month. I know for us, we wanted to kind of do a series and focus on stories, Afro-Latino heroes. And so we kind of just hit that off last week and just started sharing that on our Facebook and Instagram and all our social media channels. For us, I think I would just even go a step further. Just for me personally, that banner of Afro-Latino hits home just because my children, I think, identify, I not think they racially identify as Afro-Latino. I happen to be Latino. My wife is Black, and I was just actually talking to Al right before the show. She just recently found out through family that they have Haitian roots, right? So it's fantastic, I think, just to see the level of inclusivity here. Now, is there representation? I think that's the question, right? I think that it would be really great to see more representation of our Afro-Latinos in the state of Minnesota. I think I look forward to seeing that. It's really great that on the council we have a 12-person board of directors, and these are public positions that people can apply, and the governor appoints these positions based on congressional districts. I would say this is an invitation to any Afro-Latino out there. Hey, your voice is needed, and I think that would be a fantastic way to represent and just have more conversations about Afro-Latinos.
Well, thank you for sharing your personal story. And that's what I do in this program all the time, is really go to the person's own genealogy and their sense of self, of why they do the work that they're doing. And if you don't mind, Luis, what's your family background? You said your parents were here and you grew up in the community. What's the story of your genealogy?
Yeah, I mean, to make a very cool story, I mean, I've actually, I've gone back and forth with my parents. I'm like, I want to write a book. I just think that their stories just so, and I feel like most people have that sense of like, wow, I can't believe that you've gone through all of this, right? So Salvadoran American background. My parents grew up in El Salvador. They had planned to live their entire life in El Salvador. No plans. It's funny because they say they shared years later they had the option to take an English elective. They're like, why? But I think as history, we kind of know 70s, 80s, Iran Contra. There were just issues, civil war in El Salvador. So my parents ended up having to flee the country. They left. They sought refuge here in the United States. And years later, I was born. We lived in California for a good number of years. And gosh, I mean, that was humble beginnings because, right, we're not established. You're starting from scratch. So first generation American here. Honestly, didn't even know just how bad it probably was until our parents told us years later. There were, again, times where it was hard to even just get enough money to buy the milk, to sharing cheeseburgers at McDonald's, right? So I look now at just, again, that entrepreneurial spirit that my parents had. We moved to Minnesota looking for a better life. I think you hear something on a lark, and that's exactly what happened. My dad heard, hey, the situation is so much better here in Minnesota than it is in California. You should come. Let's check it out. And sure enough, I think our lives transformed overnight. The education system in Minnesota, beyond what California had to offer. There was more systems of support here. I think for the first time we were actually like in ELL classes. So I mean, kudos to just how education is structured here in Minnesota. I'm thankful. I think because of that change, it completely kind of set the trajectory for where I am today. I don't think that my life would have been the same had I stayed in California. So
From the El Salvador beginning, would you describe your family as indigenous or a mixture of indigenous and Spanish?
Mixture. Yep. So, and it's funny, and I think it's now that, you know, we're in this day and age where we can go back and we can do like DNA tests, and I think there's this want to find out what your identity is, find out what your background is, and so we are part Pipil is the indigenous group in El Salvador. So part indigenous, but part also just a bunch of different groups. So from my mother's side is where we kind of see more of that indigenous side, and then a mixture from my parents, from my dad's side.
Yoji, how did you come to Minnesota? What was your story for getting to Minnesota?
Well, I was living in Argentina. I lived in Argentina for 11 years, and in the austral summer of '89, I went to Chile with my capoeira group to do presentations. And when I returned, when I opened my apartment, there was a group of Americans inside of my apartment that I have subleased to a friend of mine, and he was kind of hosting these people. So there I met the one that became my wife. And we lived in Buenos Aires for 2 years, and then we moved to Minnesota. Yeah, and never was also my dream destination, or never, you know, I never was a Americanophile, you know.
That's a new term for me. Explain that.
Yeah,
Huh?
I've not heard it.
That's a new term for me.
Americanophile, a lover of America.
Oh.
Okay, America. Okay, got it. I got it. Okay.
Americanophile. I invented that word, so
Okay.
I'm gonna
Copyright,
that.
trademark it. That's yours
Yes.
now. Put it on a shirt.
Exactly. And then it was very strange when I arrived. I remember I arrived in February. Wow, 12, something like that. Yes. Wow. It's, I think, in 2 days. And the snow, I never seen snow, or I haven't felt that extreme cold. And because of the snow, the noise was muffled, very quiet, and was very strange. And then I start having kids in Minnesota and delay my stay, and getting to understand how to navigate, the state, the cold. My principal problem was always the weather. Yeah, that's how I ended up in Minnesota.
Okay,
And
good story.
I left because of the reasons was the pandemic and the death of George Floyd. That was pretty close to me. It was 2 blocks from my house. I used to live on 38 in Oakland. So the whole neighborhood, you all know that changed after his death, that got closed, and there was a lot of gunshots at night. So that was agitating a lot on my son. And together with the pandemic, I kind of get into a panic. I decided if it was the case that my death was to come soon, I would die here. So I decided to come back here. Yeah.
Interesting. And how did you observe the change in the community with the increase of people, as you mentioned earlier, not only from South America, Central America, but also from West Africa, and now the Asian and East African populations increasing dramatically. I mean, the landscape has changed. Let me tell you guys one thing. You know, a lot of my African American friends on the march towards what we call consciousness, and many chose to examine the names, you know, and so, and Al McFarlane has to ask, why is my name Al McFarlane, right? And for many of us, the name is the adoption of the colonizer's name, right, and naming system, or some variation or some response to the fact that we were in a enslaved and colonized position. And that was how our communities and cultures responded to that. So in achieving and continuing the path to freedom and self-determination, self-realization, some would choose to take African names. I had invited some kings from Ghana to an event that I had here in Minnesota, and at the Art Institute over in South Minneapolis. And one of the kings was named Barima Kojo Eduaka IV. And as he was addressing this crowd of primarily African Americans from our community that I had assembled, he said, where do you all get these funny names from? I look at you and you tell me your name is Judy? Your name is William? How do you get a name like Robert? You know, and so it was just, you know, we take those names for granted, not to be questioned. He's saying, but where you come from, your name has specific meaning to family, legacy, order of arrival, events that happen in the community. And if you told me your name, I would know something about you. In our culture, this is in Akan culture in Ghana. There may be variations on the theme throughout the diaspora. I don't know.
See,
And so,
I envy that, Al. I mean, because I've walked up to people and they'll tell me their name, and then they'll tell me the meaning of their name, or you find out that, you know, again, there's some names out there that, you know, have just these beautiful kind of meanings, and then I look at my name and I'm like, there's no meaning for Luis. I look it up and it just refers to Louis. It's a, you know, it's a variation on Louis, and then Louis is referring to the King Louis, and then it's
right.
Just, no, but Luis comes from light in Latin.
Oh,
Luz.
Yoji. I've never heard that. See, and again, I mean, Google's my only source, so I've never
Luis,
heard.
So the name is older than the king, Luis. You know, so it comes from Latin. That means light.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Lucia, Luis, Luisa, Lucia, no, all these variations.
Now I know.
Lucero.
Now I can do that.
Yeah.
And so the point I was going to make, that's great, thanks Yoji for that, is this question of identity and us discovering identity. I think it's important, it's critical, it's useful, and it inspires a person individually to arrive at being herself, his self, their best self, because they have a sense of knowledge of their place in creation, right? And so, given that, Yoji, I was going to ask you, how have you seen the dynamic shift in power? And for me, it's not enough, but there has been a shift from when you first arrived in what 80s? You said 80 and
90.
90. What was the difference that you saw? And Luis, maybe the same thing from your point of view from the time you arrived in Minnesota. What's been the difference in the presence of the immigrant and Latino communities? I also wanted to ask you, Luis, to give us a breakdown, a roadmap of what the elements are of the Latino community. El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico is what we all had been led to group everybody in. And in the Mexican community, there were those that said, no, Chicano, right? As opposed to Mexican, and that we are part of a nation called Aztlan, right? And Aztlan predates the United States. And we simply are claiming what we always own. We've been here forever because we're part of the indigenous population that you all, colonizers, usurped. So give me your sense of how much change took place in your period here, Yoji, and you too, if you would, Brother Luis.
Well, to me, as I said, I mentioned the presence of Ecuadorians. That is a small country, even here in South America. They don't have much kind of exposition, unless the last few months about that violence that happened over there. And the other one is also the emergency and the establishment of the Somalis. That also I think is very remarkable, because from the time that I arrived there, there were very few. Now there are, in numbers, there are great numbers. But what is very interesting to watch is how they rapidly gain political power and organize plug themselves into the power structures or the decision makers of Minnesota. And, so it's like you find now Somali police officers, female Somali police officers that are kind of, at the time that I was there, it was becoming common. I would see also one thing was the diversification of the police force too of Minneapolis with all their problems. There was a bigger presence of Latinos. I have a great friend and ex-student in Minneapolis police that is Sargento Baires, Carlos Baires from the Lake Street beat. So, and also I have noticed sometimes, as we mentioned earlier, Al, the uncomfortability of the local blacks or blacks that have been established there for more years. Sometimes they express they feel the unfair, the numbers, and that in a certain way, some immigrants climbed faster, But it is this peculiar cases about the things that just happens in the United States. That same time is so racist and oppressive in certain areas. In the other, or sometimes I think are blind spots in the system that allows us as minority to have great achievements that are bigger even than in our own countries of origin.
Luis, what are your thoughts?
Yoji kind of hit a really important piece, right? I think it's really cool to see today so much more representation than we've seen in the past, or even, Yoji, you came in the 90s. I came here towards early 2000s, and just even see the difference in a 20-year span, just that much more representation is phenomenal. Now it's a journey, right? Because I think that we're on this journey. I think that we could continue on this trajectory and see that much more representation in elected positions at the state, local, and federal level, right? But even today, we have a Latina mayor in Columbia Heights. We have a Latino mayor in Bemidji. It's areas where we have organizations that are popping up in greater Minnesota and all around, where we're seeing more of that representation. And that's powerful. I mean, growing up in a community and not having a place to call your own or kind of identify or to be able to group and come together. I think, when we look back at even some of the things that are on the public policy agenda, a good number of initiatives on there are really trying to kind of establish these places where communities can come together and just find representation. I think for the first time ever, I actually posted just a week ago or two on LinkedIn. I said, hey, I'm trying to find a Toastmasters class that's only for Spanish speakers. And I looked it up. In the entire nation, there's only like 4 Toastmasters that were for Spanish speakers, and like and they were online, right? And then sure enough, even a couple days later, this is what I love about community, right? You put something out there and it just comes right back. And someone said, La Doña Cerveceria in Minneapolis is doing this kind of a like public speaking kind of workshops every Tuesday, and you should check it out. And I said, "Oh, that's fantastic!" And again, it's like
That's over here in North Minneapolis, right? Down in Glenwood.
I think so. Yeah.
Uruguayan owner.
Hmm.
He's from Uruguay, the owner.
Okay, Uruguay. Okay. Cool.
But yeah. And again, I think it's really cool to just see organizations like that kind of open up space to grow the community, right? Even though it's like cerveceria, right? I think on top of that, they open up their space like every Thursday to nonprofits for free. And it's just one of those things, like it's initiatives like that just kind of make me proud as a Latino, just seeing that other, and this isn't someone who's in an elected position, right? This is just an example of just one business that's making an impact in that community. Now imagine all of these other Latino organizations and businesses that are in each and every community.
Let me take a break for a sponsoring message, then we'll come back. I want to ask Luis and Yoji to go into something that you brought up, Yoji, and it came out of the conversation that you and I had this morning. We had our staff meeting this morning talking about an article that's going to be running in Afrodescendientes, and the article talks about how some African Americans feel that immigrants get higher priority than African Americans, and that there's an intentionality in continued suppression because there's an unwillingness to face the truth of horrific oppression that European culture visited upon African people via the transatlantic slave trade, and that process throughout this country, but also throughout the hemisphere. And the question I want you guys to think about before we come back is both sides of that coin. How do we figure out the changes we need to make in how society is structured, how governance is structured, so that all of our communities can thrive and survive. And it's not a question of us being pitted one against the other in the classic model of divide and conquer, culturally, and to a certain degree today, everywhere in the hemisphere, we're struggling with the legacy of English or Spanish or European colonial domination and its consequences. We'll come right back. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll be back in a second. Are you or someone you know recovering financially from the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, or any other reason? If so, help is available. FindHelp.org is a site to find a wide range of resources, including food, medical care, and more. The best part is based on your zip code. Visit FindHelp.org, enter your zip code and the service you need. You'll get a map directing you to the organizations that can help you. Help is waiting at FindHelp.org. If you need help starting anew, FindHelp.org is the site for you. I'm Al McFarlane. A note from my friend Antonio Rosell. Antonio says, greetings, Al. Great to see you and your wonderful guests today. Very wise observations about names and their importance. Antonio, if you've got the time, send an email over to Cooper@insightnews.com, and he'll bring you into the conversation. You've got a lot of work that you've been doing in the hemisphere for freedom and liberation, and also about the environment. And so love to hear your voice. So glad you sent the note. So if you send a note to Cooper at Insight News, he'll send you a link. We'll bring you on the program. So gentlemen, before I go to that last question, I want to make sure that we really properly talk about Monday's event. And one of our chief goals today was to invite people to show up at 8 o'clock Monday and at 9, and then just to be set on following and supporting the agenda at the legislature. So Luis, let me have you go back to explaining, kind of some of the priorities. There's one flyer you had that listed the policy issues. Maybe you can walk through those quickly.
Yeah.
You can pull them up.
So as that's coming up, right, we'll just kind of go over the times. So we have a rally in support of the first Latino Museum at 8:30 in the morning in front of the Capitol steps. Then we're streaming the press conference. So I mean, it's a very small room, so there's probably going to be just room for media, right? So we ask, if anyone wants to support, you can watch it live on Facebook through ASID Minnesota's Facebook page. So that'll be streaming, and then we'll also try to tag as many organizations so that we can just kind of have that out. And I think we're going to kind of be rebroadcasting the press conference through Insight News, correct?
That's right. That's the 9:30 to 10:30 event. We're going to be streaming that on our Monday program.
So that's going to be fantastic. I think that's just going to really allow people to just be more aware. And I think that's kind of what my role really here is, just to make sure that we engage, that we can make more of our community members aware of what's happening and what's being presented at the legislature.
Walk us through the public policy agenda summary, if you would.
Yes. So we've got 11 Latino-led organizations, right? And so they've been having discussions. They've worked together on this on a longer, like a 4-page, essentially agenda of a number of bills, a number of initiatives, a number of different areas where they would like to focus. And economic development and workforce was an area that really was really strong this year in terms of bills that are out there. Some of those include, protections for employees that are out there in the state of Minnesota. So, I mean, the best part is that when we're presenting some of this legislation, it's not just going to be for the Latino community, right? This could also help the Minnesota as a whole. I think that's been the message kind of from this current administration. It's, one Minnesota, and it's been really cool just to kind of see that level of engagement just across state agencies, but also now, again, just at the local level with just Latino-led organizations. Education is another big area. There's been some wins last year with there was some language on Increased Teachers of Colors Act. So there's going to be more information on that and certain things that just didn't pass from last year's bill that'll kind of be focused on this year as well. There are other initiatives that these organizations are going to be talking about within the press conference. Arts and cultural development, that'll kind of speak on certain projects that these organizations are wanting to focus on. Healthcare and well-being. This is an area I think that these organizations, while there might not be any legislation this year, it's something that we want to make sure that other communities know that this is important to us. While we don't have any particular bill that will be probably discussed on Monday for healthcare and well-being. No, sorry, I'm actually looking down. There are some areas. There are going to be some talking points that'll be discussed or kind of over. Democracy and voting rights, right? Belonging and integration. This is essentially like policies that really look at all Minnesotans, including the Latino residents that are here, that are working all over the state. So there's going to be conversations or talks on what what kind of access could potentially be provided to Latinos, especially those that are users of the ITIN. So, there's already systems in place, and it's now allowing to use those systems potentially for more access, correct? And I believe that there is one bill on clean energy that will be discussed as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So look, let me go back to the question I did before. Antonio may be joining us. I sent him a note, sent a link to him. But how do we navigate, number one, integrity within all of our cultural realities and a process that affords us to respect and support each other without diminishing or devaluing each other, ourselves, or even those that we know have been complicit in the denial of opportunity for us? Our solution, as I see it, is not to treat them like they treated us, but our solutions have to be to show how human beings should be in the best way possible. That's what I think. Hey, Antonio, how you doing, my friend?
I am doing great. Thank you very much, Al.
Meet Luis and meet Yoji.
Good afternoon, Luis, Yoji. Wonderful to meet you. Al, thank you for the invitation to join you today. I appreciate
it. So the big question I have right now, we've got about 10 minutes to go all together, is the question of how do we navigate this idea of culture, identity, moving forward as our numbers grow and as our sophistication increases, and as we move with intentionality towards the levers of power, including entrepreneurship. How do we avoid becoming that which put us in a negative position and which put humanity itself and our planet at risk? And I throw that because I know that you are an environmentalist and are concerned about the integration of all of existence, both the physical or the material and the human and the spiritual that make up our lives. Let me start with you just to tell your credentials. You are an engineer, I think, right?
Yes.
And you've also been active in the Cuba project. You've been part of several delegations to bring relief to Cuba.
Yes, thank you, Al. And it's interesting because my Minnesota story begins kind of with my story of as an engineer. I came to Minnesota to work. I'm originally from Peru. My family, we left Peru during a time of a lot of instability, same as the story of Luis with his family leaving El Salvador. We left at a time of instability, and we were able to travel to the United States with a tourist visa. Landed in Miami and just overstayed our tourist visa and lived as as illegal aliens for about almost 10 years till we were able to get this amnesty. And since then, once we were able to have papers, I was able to go to college to get my engineering degree after finishing high school. So I did my engineering degree, came to Minnesota when I found an opportunity with the Department of Transportation here, worked there for 5 years, went back to university for grad school, been working to study urban planning. And I've been working in planning, working with communities of all sizes, started working in Minneapolis, but now I'm actually doing quite a lot of work in greater Minnesota, so rural Minnesota, communities of 3,000, 5,000 people. And that story that Luis mentioned about the huge growth in immigrant populations, and in many cases, Hispanic populations, where 30% of our community now. I'm working, for example, in the city of Melrose, which is about an hour and a half away from the Twin Cities. Over the last 20 years, it's now almost 30% Hispanic. People move there to work in the Jennie-O turkey plant and all the meat packing, etc. Part of the story has to do with what happened in our countries of origin. Luis, your family left because of unrest. My family left because of unrest. It's very painful to leave your country. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to leave everything behind and then come to a new place where you don't know anyone, you don't know the language, and it's very difficult. It was difficult for us. But in the case, Al, you asked this question, what is it that brought people to the United States in this last, since the 90s? I was here if I heard somebody speaking Spanish on the bus when I got here in 1994, I would go up to them and say hello, just because I miss the language. I miss talking to somebody. Now, 3, 4, 5 years later, Spanish was everywhere. The story of Lake Street and the revitalization of Lake Street with all the immigrant entrepreneurs that came from Mexico and from Ecuador. Thank you, Yoji, for saying that too. I have great friends from Ecuador that came and opened a restaurant on Lake and Bloomington and asked me to help them set it up. I worked with them for about 6 months. It was an amazing, difficult story too. But what happened in Mexico in particular was the passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which made it very easy for U.S. Companies to export the subsidized grain that we grow in the United States to undermine the rural sector of Mexico. And it's not just farmers, but all the small shops, all the small business owners in the rural communities, all of that dried up as they were outcompeted by subsidized exports from the United States. You can't compete against that. The richest country in the world subsidizes its agriculture and then dumps it on your country. What are you going to do? You're destitute. So anyway, there's huge stories to talk about, huge impacts throughout the Americas and in the rest of the world as well for similar issues. I don't want to give a super long introduction, but I'll just say a couple more things.
Go ahead.
Thank you. There is, yes, I do quite a lot of work of solidarity work in Cuba, through an organization called Pastors for Peace. It was originally led by a wonderful Reverend Lucius Walker, historic Black church in New York, in Harlem, a pastor in the civil rights movement with a vision of how what happens here in the US actually has so much impact with communities elsewhere. And it's actually from one of the last the Riverside speech from Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, talking about our role. This is a speech in 1967 where he spoke up and spoke out against the war in Vietnam because of all the destruction that we were perpetrating on people half a world away, for the benefit of corporations, the rich and powerful, and imperialism that our nation was perpetrating. So I'll just say one more thing related to this. Today, we are witnessing live 24/7 a genocide being perpetrated against the people of Gaza, right? Where it's happening. It's 4 months now. Our nation makes it possible. We are accomplices. We fund the government of Israel. We provide them with weapons. We provide billions of dollars to them every year. Right now, there's bills that want to send $16 billion over there so that they can continue to slaughter women and children. We've cut off the funding to the relief agency that provides for food and water. They've been cut off now for 4 months. So as people who live in this country, we sometimes forget we have a lot of power to make change in the world because we are oftentimes the nation that drives these issues. So,
Yoji, let me ask you to weigh in here. You and I had this conversation before this program as well about the similarity of the strategy to marginalize and reduce, to ignore the humanity of populations for the advantage of minorities that don't want to be seen as minorities. They want to present themselves as the standard and as the majority, but they are not. They are a minority. And how does this process show up again and again throughout the hemisphere? And how does it impact the original question I asked Yoji, how we, persons of color, interact or fail to interact? how do we either learn our power or ignore our power and let what is happening in the world go unchecked? What do you think, Yoji?
Well, today I was earlier listening to Luis talking about the organization that he represents, that's like umbrella organization alliance, and I was at the same time thinking how difficult for Black people being there in Brazil, in the US, here in Brazil. It's very difficult to us unify or have organisms that represent different voices of our communities. So I think this issue get a little bit, we gain a little bit of power when information got democratized through access to technologies, right? And that has produced, in my point of view, many changes. Even those changes are, for example, the election of Barack Obama, the election of Lula here, that I mentioned to you earlier, might have been that the capitalist system that has been perfecting itself over time, right? To me, in my point of view, capitalism starts with the supposedly discovery of America, right? The proto-capitalism, slavery. Because, for example, when we talk about slavery, our ancestors, the enslaved people, they were not people, they were fuel. They were oil of today, right? Those people were what had energy to transform things and products with aggregated value. So we were fuel. We were like gasoline, oil, or diesel oil. Our significance for the system was that, not of humans. As we, in certain way, got freed from the clause of slavery, that also was because of economical ploy that they decided, right? First with England outlawing the slave trade, outlawing slavery, and what, and in all the places where there was slavery, when there was an abolition of slavery, never was a social program to integrate those ex-enslaved people into the.
Yoji, let me stop you there because we're out of time. We're over our limit here. But this is a great conversation. We'll have to come back to it. I want to thank you, Yoji, as always, for your work leading our Afro-Descendientes. Thank you, my friend Antonio Rosell. Good to see you, my friend. And Luis Argueta, thank you so much. Good to work with you. I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a regular engagement with the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs and beyond, particularly to support the idea of the emergence and the visibility of the Afro-Descendiente community. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.